Welcome to the second webinar of the Botanic Gardens Biosecurity webinar series. Welcome to all of our online viewers. I'm Danielle Carnival. I'm from Plant Health Australia and the Botanic Gardens Biosecurity Network. This webinar series is being coordinated by the Botanic Gardens Biosecurity Network. Now, this network is coordinated by Plant Health Australia with support from expert collaborators. The project's funded by the Australian Government Agricultural Competitiveness White Paper, which is the government's plan for a stronger farmers and a stronger economy. So today's talk, we will have Louise Rossiter, who is currently the leader of plant pest surveillance at the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. In this talk, Louise will talk to us a little bit about what plant pest surveillance is and why it's important. And we're really lucky to have Louise taking the time out to give this presentation to us today. So just before we jump into Louise's chat, we just have a few housekeeping things that I'd like to go through. So today, all online attendees will be on mute. We have a panel today as part of the webinar, and this panel is composed of Botanic Gardens project team staff, and they will be here to help answer any of your questions. So today, we'll be taking questions through the chat box function. So we would like you to ask questions as they come up, even have a chat through this function at any time. So you can ask questions directly to the panel or to all participants of the webinar. We will be trying to answer as many of these questions during the webinar as they come through. However, if we are unable to answer any questions during the webinar, we will be taking those questions and responding to them and providing responses after the webinar, when we also provide a link to the recorded webinar. This webinar will be recorded and provided at a later date to all attendees. So with that, I would like to now hand over to Louise Rossiter to talk to us about surveillance.
Thanks, Daniela. I think I'm not muted anymore, so hopefully you can all hear me. Yes, so today I am going to talk about surveillance, primarily from a plant pest perspective, but a lot of what I'll talk about actually does extend into the same general principles that would be applied if you were doing surveillance for, say, invasive species or even from an animal health perspective. Okay, so a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about is basically what is plant pest surveillance, why do we do it and who does it, what's involved in the actual planning and then actually doing. How do we prioritise, given that there are hundreds or even thousands of potential plant pests out there that might be of interest to us, and then an example of some surveillance that we have done in recent times. And just for your reference, whenever I refer to a plant pest, I am referring to something that affects plant health, and within this context we're talking about invertebrates such as insects and mites or snails, slugs, but also the pathogens that cause diseases in plants such as fungi and bacteria and viruses. So basically, what is plant pest surveillance? At its simplest, it's a process which collects and records data on the presence or absence of pests or a particular characteristic, and it's done through surveying or monitoring or other procedures. Those plant pests of interest might be exotic, so they're not actually present anywhere in Australia at all, or they might be present either across the entire country or just in particular states or regions. Surveillance is broadly broken down into two different categories. Specific surveillance, which is a defined survey, often completed or coordinated generally by government agencies, and can involve collaboration from outside groups. And then general surveillance, which is where you collect information on a pest of concern from various sources. And those sources may be information held by governments or from universities, They might be information gleaned from people in particular plant industries, consultants and even farmers, unpublished data, and also information collected by the general public. And what can be a really good source of general surveillance data is reporting by the public via such mechanisms as the Exotic Plant Pest Hotline. This is a number that connects anyone that wants to make a report anywhere in Australia through to the agency that's responsible for investigating those reports. And so it's the easiest way really to report any unusual symptoms or suspect exotics. And that's something I'll come back to later. So why do we do surveillance? Ultimately, surveillance is aimed at supporting plant health. At its simplest, and by definition, we do it to find out about a pest, its status. Is it present or is it absent? Or maybe some other characteristics, like what sort of numbers is it present in, how severe is an infection, what are the hosts that that pest is found on? And then how we use that information will depend on where we're doing the surveillance and for what purpose. So, for example, surveillance can be done to provide an early warning. So, surveillance for particular pests might be done offshore at some of our near neighbours, some of the countries that are near Australia, to get an idea of the possibility of those pests later arriving in Australia through, for example, natural pathways such as the wind. We also do surveillance to support early detection. So early detection is really important because the earlier we can detect a pest, the better chance we have of restricting its spread and managing it, and even ultimately of eradicating that pest. So during an eradication program, we also do surveillance, and this is done to try and work out how far spread a pest is, and that will ultimately define whether we can even effectively do eradication in the first place. And if we can, then where do we need to take action in order to eliminate that pest? We also do surveillance to support market access, to provide evidence that we don't actually have a pest. So this can ultimately involve doing surveillance to prove that a pest actually isn't present, and therefore we can export particular produce to other countries or other parts of Australia that are likewise trying to keep that particular plant pest out. And we call this evidence of absence, and it's crucial for access to markets, both in Australia and overseas. And finally, we do monitoring for pests that we already do have here that are established. So for example, we might monitor the arrival of a pest or the activity of a pest, say after a winter season, when it starts to become active again in spring, so that we have an idea when we need to take action to protect our plants or our crops. So who does the surveillance largely depends on the purpose of the surveillance activity, and historically governments have been responsible for leading surveillance activities, and certainly the federal government, for example, takes the lead on doing the early warning pre-border surveillance. And then the state and territory governments have a key role in emergency response and limiting surveillance. And governments, while they're also involved in surveillance for early detection and area freedom and monitoring, also look to the support from both industries that will benefit from a particular surveillance activity, as well as the public, either individuals or even particular groups such as an environmental group or a land care group. The role of industry as well as the general public in supporting pest surveillance can be extremely powerful, because government obviously can't be everywhere all the time, and they likewise don't necessarily have access to a lot of the locations where a plant pest could be hiding out, such as someone's backyard. So the involvement of everyone can greatly benefit plant pest surveillance. So now I'm just going to run through what's involved in the process of actually planning surveillance activity, and some of the things that you might need to consider to ensure that your surveillance actually meets its purpose and you can have confidence in what you've been doing from a surveillance perspective. And you're not going to necessarily do these things in this order, and what is required for one of these steps might actually determine what is done for some of the other steps. So as I've already said, there are a number of reasons you do surveillance. And once you've actually identified what your surveillance is actually going to be, that will actually lock in particular options as far as some of the other factors that you need to consider. We need to know, obviously, what exactly we are looking for, either from an invertebrate perspective, or are we looking for a pathogen that causes a disease? And will we actually look for the actual pest, or will we be looking for symptoms that might indicate that the pest is present, such as damage to plants or plants that might look unhealthy? And when we're looking for it, where will we find it? And often the best place to find a pest is actually on the plant that it is affecting. But sometimes you might look on the ground for a particular pest, and other times you might actually end up looking on inanimate objects such as the sides of buildings or around lights or sheltering in the most unlikely places. If you're looking at hosts, it's important that you know the host range of a particular pest that you're looking at. So some things will be very specific. They'll only affect a small number of plants within a specifically defined genus or family, and other things could well affect hundreds of different types of plants. And we also need to think about those plants that we're not even particularly bothered if they are attacked by a particular pest, such as weeds, because those weeds can often be much easier to access in the landscape than, say, a crop or particular plants in backyards. So, for example, a few years ago, we were looking at a new mite species in Sydney Basin, and this had a host range that included tomatoes and capsicums and other members of that family. And it also included the nightshade weeds, which are distributed all over the Sydney Basin. And in fact, a lot of nightshade is distributed across the whole state in easily accessible places such as roadsides and parks. So we were able to go looking at those particular plants as an indication of how far spread this particular mite might be. So when we're looking for hosts, we would access various different fact sheets, but also a particular site of choice is the CABI site. And indeed, this site gives a lot more information than just the host, which again can be really useful for doing our surveillance. So we have our target pests and we know what the hosts are. And as I said before, we're either going to be looking for the pest or we're going to be looking for signs of its presence, such as the damage or overall decline of a particular plant in health. However, sometimes if we wait until we see the symptoms or the damage, then it might be too late to actually do anything about it. And likewise, when we're looking for particular pests, we might not actually be looking for the life stage that causes the damage. So for example, if we were looking for a particular weevil, it might be easier to find the adult on the plant rather than the larva that might be inside a seed pod, but that's actually the thing that's doing all the damage. And likewise, some diseases can be vectored by particular insects, so spread by particular insects. So it might be easier to find the insect and test it for the presence of the particular pathogen rather than wait until the symptoms of the disease is found. Because for a lot of diseases, they might take several years before you start to see the symptoms. And again, by then it's too late to actually do anything about it. So it's important to have a really good understanding, good handle on the biology of the pest that you're interested in order to understand the best way to find it. All this ultimately feeds into and determines our surveillance methodology. And if you're really lucky, you'll find surveillance protocols or work that others have done previously that will help guide you as far as what you need to do for surveillance. They might tell you everything you need to know and you can just follow it as it is, or it might just give you a bit of an idea and then you can tweak it to meet your particular surveillance requirements. So really, how are we going to do our surveillance once we've got all that background information? So it might be as simple as just a visual inspection or an observation, looking for a pest or its symptoms. You can do this with the support of good quality photographs or a description of what to look for and where. And the key with this is trying to actually highlight those distinguishing features, particularly when you're looking for something that might look very similar to other established pests that we already have. And you also want to include the typical symptoms, but also the atypical symptoms, because we know that things don't usually sit perfectly still in the landscape or look exactly like the perfect symptoms. And again, visual surveillance might actually not be as simple as just wandering around, looking at plants, looking at the undersides, having a bit of a look around basically. So for example, forestry surveillance, which is near impossible when you're looking at forests or established plantations. So the trees are tall and there's lots of them, so you can't just wander around looking in the canopy of those things. And so for example, in that case, you might be using visual surveillance but aerial surveillance, where you can look for differences in a plantation, both over time as well as across an area. You can look for changes in canopy colour, you could look for changes in just general plant health, and then go back to on the ground and do the further investigations. Trapping can be a really good use of resources that allows for more continual surveillance over time. And you can also be more specific. So if you use a pheromone, for example, which is a chemical which will attract the particular pest that you're interested in. And the converse of this is something like a sticky trap, which there's a picture of there in the top right-hand corner, which basically will catch anything that happens to just blow into it. Sweeping and beating plants that you think might have the pest in them can be also very effective for finding a pest. But again, you might find all sorts of interesting things as well as the particular pest that you're interested in. Things such as detection dogs can also be highly beneficial when doing surveillance. So the dogs can be trained to detect a particular pest, and indeed this is one method that has been employed in Queensland as part of their fire ant surveillance. And sometimes in order to accurately determine the presence or absence of a pest, you just need to take random samples of either suspect pests or hosts for analysis back in the lab. And that's particularly when you're dealing with something that's not particularly easy to find or diagnose, identify in the field. So it can be important for pests that look very similar to ones that we've already got, or similarly for diseases which again look similar and require specialised lab tests to actually diagnose. We also need to think about when we're going to do surveillance. So time of day, some organisms are more active in the mornings or the evenings, as also the time of year, which might be related to the climatic conditions which will affect both the growth stage of the plant, but also the growth stage that you're targeting for the actual organism. So if you're looking for symptoms, for example, in deciduous trees, you're not going to time your surveillance in winter because they've lost all their leaves and you won't see anything. Your surveillance requirements will also dictate when you do surveillance. So for example, if something is an exotic plant pest incursion, surveillance needs to be done right away. You don't have the luxury of waiting around for the ideal conditions. And indeed, rather than the life stage targeted, defining when you do surveillance, the need to do surveillance at a particular time might actually define what life stage you end up targeting. And then we've got frequency. How often are you going to do your surveillance and how many times? So to prove and maintain freedom, you might decide that you need to do surveillance annually. Whereas to follow up on an investigation in response to a detection in another state, you might just need to do the surveillance once to prove that it's not present where you're looking. And of course, underlying all our surveillance efforts is diagnostics, and we really can't do surveillance without diagnostics. It's fine if you don't find what you're looking for or anything remotely like what you're looking for, but as soon as you find something suspect that looks like it could be a target, you need to have accurate and timely diagnostics. And those methodologies may be simply the characteristics of a particular pest, or it might involve more complicated laboratory methods such as molecular or enzyme methods. You can also reduce the burden on the diagnostic lab by having a triage process in the field. So again, good quality pictures to make sure that you're only sampling the highly suspect things, or in-field specialised diagnostics such as LAMP. You also need to make sure, or the diagnosticians need to make sure that they have positive controls so that they can have confidence in their assays and in their diagnosis. And then underpinning all this are collections of particular pathogens as well as invertebrates that can be used as a reference source. So within New South Wales, for example, we have our plant pathology and mycology herbarium, and we also have our insect and mite collection. So they are a ready resource for comparison with particular things when they come back and they come in from the field, but they also serve as a reference for what has been actually found in New South Wales, which can again help when we're trying to claim that we don't have particular pests or diseases. And then we have our surveillance design. So in many situations, such as when you're in a large crop or in a forest with many hosts, it might not be practical to actually survey every single plant. So you have to decide which of the plants that you're going to survey. So surveillance might be random across the space, or it can be much more systematic. And there are advantages and disadvantages to both. But the key, however, is to make sure that all the elements of your surveillance plan are considered when you're determining your design, and that you can provide scientifically backed justification or other justification for why you've chosen a particular method. And critical to being able to actually analyse and use the information that you collect during surveillance is data capture. Collecting and managing the information that sits behind your surveillance activity. So essentially all those details that the factors that we've just covered. So it might be as simple as a paper form that's filled out during surveillance, or it might extend to an electronic based record, such as the app that is shown here, which is an app that was developed by Western Australia to support public reporting in Western Australia. Critical is a system that can link diagnostics to the particular surveillance event so that everything, the surveillance record accurately identifies what was actually collected and matches up. And ultimately, we want a system that allows for sharing of information, because again, you do surveillance for a particular purpose and you usually need to share it with people to satisfy that purpose. As I said at the start, there are many pests that we might be interested in knowing about. So how do we prioritise which are the ones that we're going to put our resources towards? So nationally, there is a top 40 pest list that has been established through various processes and criteria, which has identified the top 40 or so pests or pest groups that we should be directing our efforts towards. We also need to consider what the pathways are for the introduction and spread of these things and make sure that we target our surveillance along those pathways. So do the surveillance in the place that we're most likely to actually find our pest of interest. Some pests, no matter how hard we look for them, we're never going to find them, not until they're at least widespread and causing a lot of damage. So do we do surveillance for those, or do we look at doing other things for those particular things to protect our plant industries? So for example, put more effort into actually stopping the pest getting here in the first place. Resourcing, as always, is a practical issue. And again, this is where industry support and public reporting can add a lot of value to us being able to effectively do surveillance. And of course, the purpose of surveillance will also guide our prioritisation. Again, for example, back to an emergency response where something's been found and surveillance needs to be done immediately. So I will just briefly touch on a particular surveillance event that occurred in New South Wales a couple of years ago. And I've chosen this one because it was and still remains a very high priority pest for us, but also it involved multiple elements for completing the surveillance. So brown marmorated stink bug is a pest that's been moving across the world now for a number of years, primarily as a hitchhiker in cargo. and it attacks many different fruits and vegetables and can cause a lot of damage and can be quite difficult to control once it becomes established. So the biology of this insect means that when winter comes, it looks for places to hide and shelter out the winter. And unfortunately for us, this means things such as containers and containerised goods and vehicles are great places that it likes to go and hide in. So over the last few years, there have been a lot of interception of these pests in these goods. And when I say interception, I mean they've been found before they actually do reach our shore or are still contained within the original goods that they came in, and so they can be dealt with. In 2017, such an interception was actually reported in Western Sydney within goods that had been imported. However, there was a concern that they may have actually escaped into the surrounding bush and landscape. So New South Wales DPI with Greater Sydney Local Land Services mounted a response that was primarily a surveillance response involving trapping, visual surveillance and public reporting. So based on how far the bug could move naturally over time as it was looking for food, the Greater Sydney Local Land Services completed a vegetation survey to identify both known hosts as well as potential hosts. So again, this is another problem when you're dealing with an organism that's not present in your country. There could be hosts that particularly native hosts that particular organism's never come into contact with before. And so you have to keep I suppose, an open mind or a broad mind for what other hosts it might have or might be happy to feed on. So this survey that they did covered nearly 300 hectares in the surrounding area of where the bugs had been intercepted. And that allowed for about 171 traps to be put out near those hosts that had been identified. And those traps had a pheromone lure with them, so that would attract the brown marmorated stink bug to the trap. Those were checked across the area weekly for nearly 6 months. And then because of the urban location of that particular detection, the public in that area were also asked to keep an eye out for this particular bug and to report if they thought they'd found it. And this was achieved through a mailbox drop in the surrounding area, as well as notices in local papers and through the use of social media. And this actually provided us with several hundred reports from the public, usually supported by photographs that we could then either discount as brown marmorated stink bug, or if it looked like a suspect, organise to get a sample and get it to our diagnostic laboratories for identification. Through these efforts and the nil detection of any brown marmorated stink bug through the trapping or through the visual surveillance, we were confident that that brown marmorated stink bug had not actually escaped from that location. So due to its pathway for introduction, increased measures have been implemented to stop it arriving into Australia. However, because of the huge potential pathways for its arrival, it still remains a high priority pest for us, and it remains one of our targets in the early detection surveillance activities that we complete each year, as well as we continue to support public reporting for this particular pest. And so on that note, reporting suspect exotic plant pests, as I said earlier, or anything unusual, is very simple across Australia. We have our exotic plant pest hotline number, which, as I said, will put you straight through to the people that are responsible for investigating suspect exotic incursions in the state that you are calling from at the time. And there's also additional means in the different states for reporting suspect exotics, such as emails and online forms. So it is worth, if you're looking to report a suspect exotic, it's worth looking up alternatives, because a lot of those will support particularly things like photographs for sending in. Common, however, to however you choose to report are the sorts of questions that you'll be asked if you do decide to make a report. So what was it that you saw? Did you take a photo? Can you describe it? And often, do you actually have a sample of the organism or of the diseased plant? Again, noting that for some of the things that we're concerned about, such as bees and wasps, you need to make sure, obviously, you take care. Where was it found? What was it on? And how many were present, or how infected was the plant? And have you seen it anywhere else? So those sorts of things will help the relevant jurisdiction assess what the plant pest might be and what action is required to be taken to investigate. And I think that's my time up, and that's it from me as far as Plant Pest Surveillance 101.
Thanks, Louise. That was a very informative talk today, and hopefully we all know a little bit more about how to conduct surveillance, and we can all get out into our gardens and have a look around and know how to report as well. So thanks for that, Louise.
No worries.
So now we've gone a little bit over time today, but just before we all leave, it would be great if you could just take part in a quick survey. And this just gives us a bit of an indication on how the webinar's going and whether you're enjoying the series or not. So if you could all just take a moment to fill out that short survey. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope you all learnt a little bit more about surveillance. And we do have some more webinars coming up. So in 2 weeks' time, we will be joined by Brett Summerall, who will be looking at keeping the gardens green. So biosecurity in the Botanic Gardens of Sydney. So that will be a great talk. So we hope that you can join us in 2 weeks' time for that.